Awesome. Hello, everybody. We have Tiffany Williams, a dear friend of mine, on the podcast today, and we're going to be talking all about navigating special needs, a little bit more of the nuanced conversation of navigating loneliness and isolation and how to help people to understand what you're going through as a family, as a parent. Tiffany is, like I said, a dear friend of mine. She has coached me through different personality struggles using some Enneagram tools. And Tiffany, I'm going to let you take it away with more of your just your personal story.
Oh, thank you, Andrea. It's such a blessing to be here. It's an honor. And I have really enjoyed also gleaning from you, Andrea, with all of your wisdom about life and definitely about raising special needs kids. So I hope everyone has picked up her book, Wrapped in Kindness.
Thank you.
You're not going to want to miss it, especially if you know
Thank you.
someone. Now that it's, Father's Day season, if you
Yes.
know someone who has a kid with special needs, I think that would be a really special book to
Oh,
get.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So where did your journey with that start? So tell us a little bit about kind of the beginnings of that journey for you.
Well, when my oldest was, I think, going in for his 1 year doctor appointment, you have to fill out, like a checklist of like, can your child do this? Can your child do that?
Yeah.
And I could only check like one of them. I
Wow.
can't remember which one it was. And so at the end of the appointment, I like managed to squeak out with my bated breath, like, hey, did you notice, I could only check one of those benchmarks. And he said, oh, well, that's not good. And he referred me to a place in town that does autism testing. And I thought, like, it was just a sudden blow, like a huge blow. Like, what
Mhm.
could that be? And my nephew has autism, and that's been a real
Okay.
struggle. And so I'd watch my sister go through it, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So, long story short, sure enough, they enrolled him in our town. They have really great resources for kids with autism or that are suspected to have autism. So all of a sudden, we were doing 10 therapies a week. And we did that for years, I think like 3 years. Meanwhile, I started popping out more kids. I had 4 kids condensed into 3.5 years. And so during that whole 3.5 years of having kids, I was having 10 therapies a week. And even when my second was born, we were thinking he could have autism as well. So they enrolled him into 10 therapies a week. And it was just like crazy. Meanwhile, I think what was so interesting, by the way, he was diagnosed with autism. My second was not, but he
Okay.
was. And I think what I'd like to talk about is the isolation that you can really feel as a parent, not really knowing how to handle um, so many parts of your special needs child's journey and your own journey. How do you handle the grief you're going through while having to be at 10 therapies a week and raise 4 children? And you don't have time like you used to before kids to just go into your room and have a meltdown, or you have
Right.
to just,
Journal and cry.
yes, none of the journaling was happening. You had to just keep moving. And then
Yeah.
how do you handle explaining to friends what's going on when really your kid looks okay? I think autism is one of those silent
Yeah.
diagnoses where you don't look a certain way, but
Right.
those things are there. Or what do you do when you're at Walmart and your kid is having a full-on autism meltdown and people
Mm-hmm.
are looking at you like, just control your child, and you're like, wouldn't that be great?
Funny story. I
Right.
feel like I would have figured that out by now if
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah. So anyways,
Right.
those are just some of the things
Yes.
that can be a challenge, as when you're walking through something like that.
Absolutely. Well, and I think there's so many different layers to this too, because I remember for us, when we first enrolled our daughter in therapy, it was, let's see here. So we did the neuropsych evaluation. That was like 5 days a week, 4 hours a day, while they were, doing the diagnostic testing. And then that's really what propelled us then into all of the other therapies, right? Which is physical therapy, occupational therapy, reflex integration therapy, which I cannot speak highly enough. If you can get into MNRI, reflex integration therapy, and your child is struggling with different behavioral things, it is fantastic if you can find a good person. However, that meant, like, thank God I was working from home at the time, because I don't even know, there's no physical way that I could have managed that, because it was 5 days a week for
Yes, same
three
for us.
weeks, and then you take a break, and then you do it again, and then they reassess, and then you do it again. And, this is not even talking about like whether or not you have insurance coverage for that,
Right.
right? So
Oh,
like that's a whole other conversation. So for us, I felt like I very quickly plummeted into the land of isolation and loneliness. And I felt like even if I could talk about it, I don't have the time, because now I'm like, my life now has shifted from being able to do all the social stuff that I was able to do before, and now I can't do those things because my life is now this. And so it's almost like your friend circle shifts, and you maybe can start making friends that are in the same therapies that your child is in, right? You're sitting in the waiting room,
right.
or kind of,
Kind
but,
of.
like,
Yes.
not really, because you're so like, for me, I was so tired that I was like, I didn't have the emotional energy to, like, go make new friends. So
Yes.
I was just kinda hoping, well, whoever stays around is gonna stay around, right? But it was very isolating because, at least for us, uh, our daughter was neurotypical until she was 8, and then she got an infection, and then she was not neurotypical. So it was very, like,
Wow.
flipped on us, right? Not that it's better or worse than anybody else's, it's just that was our journey. And so isolation, what did that look like for you? Especially being somewhat extroverted, somewhat like spontaneous,
Mhm.
fun, not, now you're tied down to this schedule and multiple children, and kind of trying not to drown in your own self, right?
Definitely. And I think as I think back, I think one of the hardest things for me, and I don't even know if this was right or wrong, but just looking back, my husband had decided when our oldest was diagnosed with autism that we would never tell anyone, that we would not
Okay.
speak it over him,
Sure.
and that we would never claim that diagnosis as his diagnosis. So in a way, I'm glad we did that, because like to this day, my oldest has no idea he was ever
Mhm.
diagnosed with autism. And I would have told him, except that when he got into school, maybe first or second
Mhm.
grade, his speech therapist, my son also has profound hearing loss in both ears and wears
Okay.
hearing aids. And so the speech teacher at school did a ton of research and was like, hey, it's possible he never had autism, because
Yeah.
hearing loss and autism can really look a lot alike when they're younger.
Yeah.
And so I read all the research too, and I was like, that's a good point. Like the jury's out. So
Yeah.
we've
Yep.
decided probably it was more hearing loss, which by the way has its own issues. If anyone out
Yeah.
there has kids, who have had hearing loss, there's so much more than just not being able to hear that comes along with
Yes.
hearing loss. There's extreme difficulty with self-esteem, because imagine if
Right.
you are missing almost every word that somebody says. I
Yeah.
mean, and then his speech teacher has said that kids with hearing loss work 80% harder than other
Yeah.
kids at
Right.
school, because they're
I
having to
believe it.
filter. And so when they come home, they're the worst version of themselves, because they're working so hard. They come home,
Yep.
they kick the dog or the siblings or the parents, right?
Yes.
Anyway, there's so much that goes into that too. But at the time, my husband felt very strongly like we don't need to be telling everyone our child has
Yeah.
been diagnosed with autism. And that was so hard for me, because
Mhm.
I did sit in those waiting rooms, and I felt like I couldn't talk to the other moms who actually did understand what I was going through.
Right.
And I only like my husband was okay with me telling a few close friends, and I don't think they really knew what to do. So
Yeah.
one of them was constantly trying to help, and that was great, but it was not helpful. Like this is something
Yeah.
else that I
Yeah.
I wish people would understand. When you're going through something like autism or pandas, which is not, it can look so different for every person. Like
Right.
autism, there's such a spectrum. Like
Yep.
I think it's so much better when you're the friend, instead of trying to figure out how to solve the problem, maybe just say, how can I help? Like, what can I do?
Mhm.
I had a friend who she ended up just volunteering herself to come to my
Mhm.
house I think it was every Thursday for 2 hours or something, and just would help me do whatever I needed,
Mm-hmm.
whatever that looked like. She would
Wow.
help me sort through toys, or she would watch the kids while I ran to the store or something. That
Wow.
was awesome. But other people, try as they might. One girl was like, I know what you could do, Tiffany. Have you tried feeding your child fermented vegetables? Because all this research about how fermented vegetables help with autism. And I'm like, I can't get my kid to eat a chicken nugget.
Yeah. Like,
Like,
right.
this is,
Yeah.
uh,
My ears turn off when it's the have you tried, right? Which is I don't, not in a snarky kind of way, but like it's just at that moment, I think that where you're going with this is like it's at that moment what I just need is to not be alone
yes,
and to not feel alone in
excellent.
this struggle. I don't need you to fix it. And also on the flip side, because I've been the friend in this situation too, that's like you feel so helpless as a friend
Yeah.
to not be able to fix it that we want to fix it. Like we just want to get in there and fix it. And so I completely like I have grace for those moments, but at the same time it's kind of like I had to learn being the friend in that situation how to ask better questions.
Yes.
Tell me what that's like for you. Like
Yes.
even just that simple, because I might be trying to connect it to us, like even for you, we haven't had that experience of having that from age one on. Like our situation was different. And so while there are similarities and I might be able to pull from those similarities and empathize, I can't assume that what I went through is like what you went through, right? And so for
Mhm.
me, it helps me tremendously as a friend to be able to ask. And it also kind of feels like it takes some of the pressure off of me to figure it out. If I say, what is that like for you? Tell me what it's like for you when your child doesn't eat their food. Well, let me be honest with you. It makes me want to cry and punch a hole in the wall because there is nothing more frustrating than when you're trying to get nutrients into your kid and they will not eat it. I mean, I just had this memory like pop up a couple months ago where a friend of mine was like, "Oh, I'm freaking out because one of my kids won't eat their yogurt," and I like kind of internally chuckled a little bit and I was like, "My child survived off of like 5 foods
Same.
for 5 years."
Yeah.
And like I wasn't laughing to minimize, but I just had this moment of like, she'll be okay. You
Yes.
know, like we were doing the best we could, but with 20 new food allergies and sensory issues and food pickiness and all of that stuff, it's like, okay, well, fermented foods just are not on the table right now. So,
No,
yeah.
I like what you're saying so much. I teach a class, as you mentioned, I'm an Enneagram coach, and I also teach relationship building courses. And
Yes.
one of the classes that I teach, I talk about empathy fails. How do we fail
Yes.
at empathy? And one of the worst is like, well, why don't you just do blah blah blah? Or well, what worked for me is blah blah blah.
Yeah.
All of that could be helpful if someone asks you, well, what did you
Yeah.
do? But if they're opening up to you about something painful that's happening in their life right now, probably one of the last things you want to do is share your own story in that moment,
Yes.
unless they ask. It's so
Right.
much better for you, as you said, Andrea, to ask questions. What's going on? How does that feel? Tell me what it's like. Like, how many foods are they eating? Is that difficult? Things like that is so, because basically what you're wanting to do in those moments as a friend is extend a hand, draw that
Yes.
connection with that person. That's what's going to help them in that moment, not trying to fix their problem. That
Yes.
could help later, but in the
Yep.
moment where they're opening up to you about how hard things are, connection is the key. So yeah.
That's so good. And I also want to just say that we all fail at that. Like I catch myself still, like, oh, nope, that's not what's needed right now. That's my own internal, like, I want to fix this. I want to help them. I'm feeling their helplessness. And so, like, and that's hard. That's a hard place to be. And so I love that your friend was able to come and just, take the initiative. I did something similar where, well, I told my friends, like, I'm gonna shoot out a text if I'm having a really bad week, and I'm just gonna say SOS. And these are the typical things that are really helpful that I just don't ask me what you can do for me because I
Yeah.
can't think. Like, I can't. think, I can't problem solve, I need too many things. I need too many things. And so then for me to have to go through the list of like how to prioritize that and then have to get over myself in not wanting to burden you,
Yes.
I'm not going to get there. I'm not going to get there. And so I love that your friend was just able to say, "Hey, I'm coming on Thursdays. I will do whatever you need me to do. I don't expect this to be friend time. I don't expect this to be chatty time. I'm just here to serve you." That saves, like, it feels like it's not enough, but it literally, when you're dying on a vine and that's the one thing that you have, it's everything. And so what are some things in regards to like the loneliness and not being able to really talk about it? You mentioned, that having the friend come over was really helpful. How did you eventually, like, did you eventually start sharing with other people? Did you eventually kind of come up with maybe different language so that they didn't put him in the box? Because I think that maybe is more of our fear. Like, for me, it's more if I say this, that my child is struggling with anxiety because of pandas, they're going to put her in their box. But that may not be the truth, right, of what the box actually is. So I think for me, that's where a lot of my own personal resistance comes from when I'm sharing. So for you, how did you kind of eventually begin to start having conversations with people that felt honoring to you?
Gosh, so hard to remember back so far.
Yeah. We
It's
block it out too.
you
I think
know,
we block it out a little bit
we
too.
do. My oldest is now almost 16, so it's like, what did
Okay.
we do?
Ooh,
Um,
what?
I think you're right. I think my husband was more afraid of somebody putting him in a box and also labeling him as something that couldn't get unlabeled because,
Yeah.
as I mentioned, he probably didn't have autism.
Yeah.
We don't know. And so had we gone ahead and like let him know from the time he was little, oh, you have autism. There were books out that actually a friend had written on how to tell your kid
Yeah.
that they have autism. And I really struggled with like, shouldn't I tell him? And anyway, in my case, I'm glad I didn't
Yeah.
because he's never seen himself as having that disability, which um
Has
I don't
worked in his favor.
I don't think he
Yeah.
has. But I think for other people, I think you're right. I think, if I had to do it again, like if I could go back and relive that, I think I would want to have more conversations with my husband about, hey, why is it that you're not one
Yes.
to, and who can, are there some people that we can trust? I think we did
Yeah.
eventually open up to a few people and really let them, I mean, definitely our closest friends that we saw on a weekly basis, they knew, and they were in it with us, praying with us and celebrating with us the
Yeah.
small things. And so
Yeah.
definitely having a few people really helped. And I think too, like, here's another thing. I had a very specific way that I wanted people to respond. And
Hmm.
almost no one responded that way. I mean, nobody did because, I don't think they knew how, or
Yeah.
I think I was being very, like I just needed it a certain way. I needed like empathy and like, oh, that
You
sounds
needed the
hard.
sandwich.
Yes,
Yeah.
I needed all that. And I think almost nobody did it right in my
Yeah.
estimation. I think if I had to do it again, I think and this is some advice I would give anyone who's going through it now, is like people are going to get it wrong. They are going to get it wrong. They're not going to respond in a way that feels best to you. So spit out the bones, keep chew on, what is that saying?
Keep the
Keep the
meat,
meat
spit
and
out the
out the
bones.
bones,
Yeah.
because there is a good heart there. And also
Yeah.
don't be afraid to have honest conversations with people where you say, I love that you're helping, like that you want to help so much. I'm so grateful. I think what would be more helpful is XYZ, like actually
Yeah.
showing them what you need instead of
Yeah.
expecting them to answer in the right way, the
Yes.
way you think is
Totally.
right. It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so I think if I had to do it again, I would just be more open-handed about the way, I would have less expectations on people about the way they should respond.
Right. Right. And, honestly, I think it's really hard when you're in the thick of it because it's like you have to have the emotional energy, the emotional capacity
Yes.
to like do the internal work of like, why do I need somebody to respond this certain way? And if they don't, can I validate myself and just be like, okay, just like you said, keep the meat, spit out the bones, right? Um, and it takes a lot of energy to advocate
Right.
for yourself and how you want to feel in some of those interactions. And when you're advocating every other day of your life, getting your kid in services and talking to, I mean, for me, that was the most exhausting part was the back and forth between practitioners of how she's doing and what we're working on. And are we doing this at home? And is she, doing the skills at home? And it's like a full-time job. And so I don't then have like it's hard to muster up more to then have those conversations. So we can look back at ourselves then and be like, I have compassion for you, Tiffany. I have compassion for, that younger version of me that couldn't speak up in a way that I needed to. Um, and I do also get, with the labeling piece, I actually was talking to a friend about this recently, because I think part of that is like cultural in terms of like Christian culture, that we are careful about putting labels on things because um, we believe in, in the spirit realm and we don't want like weird things, like weird things to we don't want it to become a thing. Like I don't know how else to explain it. We don't want it to become a thing. However, one of the things that like how my perspective has changed throughout this, and I will say that's been a journey of like 5 or 6 years, and I'm kind of curious where you're at with this too, is that one, the label helped us to get the treatments that she needed. It also helped us to develop a common language between like practitioners, and I never held the belief that this was permanent. So even with that, like diagnosis, label, whatever, I personally, like when that plate of pandas was offered to me, I never looked at it as like a permanent placement in our lives. It was just kind of like this, okay, this is what it is for now. And it presents all of these different ways because that's how inflammation works in the body, but that's not going to be it's not like a permanent thing on her record. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
exactly.
And but I still think like from a Christian cultural perspective, um, like I feel that same internal hesitation sometimes about sharing about her diagnosis because I know that culturally there's still kind of this anchored belief that if I say I have this thing, then I'm like claiming it and there's like a demonic thing attached to it, which I will just say as like the inner healing and deliverance pastor, that's not always the case.
Mhm.
So, but I had to work through some fears around that. Does that make sense? I don't know if you
Absolutely.
can relate to any of
And I
that.
think, like, once we got the diagnosis of his hearing loss, obviously it's exactly what you're saying. If you try to ignore that he has hearing loss, okay, how's that going to help? How's that going to help
Right.
him? It doesn't.
Yeah.
So, immediately
Yeah.
we got hearing aids and we started taking, understanding what to do as parents differently. And we talked to every teacher and he got on an IEP at school. And I mean, of course, we
Yes.
had to do all of those things. And I'm so glad we did. But
Yes.
you're right. Like, yeah. And I think too, like, I am so grateful. Even though we kind of, I would definitely do it again differently if we had to do it again.
Sure.
We didn't share about the autism diagnosis. Even still, we didn't ignore the signs and we
Yeah.
didn't just put our heads in the sand or think, well, we're just going to name it and claim it that he doesn't, we went and got him the
Yeah.
services that we felt he needed. And I'm super
Totally.
we did.
Absolutely.
That's really
Yeah.
important.
It is important. And I think, but I do hear this a lot though from people, especially in the Christian community. And I'm not like trying to call anybody out. I'm saying this was also my struggle was like, how do I feel about this label? Like, what is my own internal
Yeah.
resistance to it? Am I taking it on as like this is going to be a permanent thing? Or am I taking it on as like I have to use a common language that everybody can understand so that we can move her through this thing, in which case that's a totally different feeling, right? And it's a
Yeah.
totally different emotional response. And it took, it wasn't just a one day thing. It was kind of like I don't know, it was a process for sure. But I do think, I do hear that a lot from um parents specifically like in the Christian culture that that are afraid to say maybe their child has a disability or a neurological problem, or that they're struggling with anxiety or depression, especially like teenagers, where
Right. That's huge.
they'll want them to come in, for inner healing and deliverance, which is great. And, we want to take that opportunity to pray. But at the same time, we don't want to ignore the reality of what they're experiencing, and that other help might also be necessary. And um, so that's like a whole other conversation. But I think you were speaking to that, in that internal struggle of, how do we talk about this, right? And what do we want our child to feel about their diagnosis if we talk about it? I will say for us with Alexis, she was 8 when she was first diagnosed with pandas, and we did the neuropsych evaluation because it actually looked a lot like autism to me. But I knew, like, she wasn't autistic a week ago, and she got an infection, and now things are all upside down and backward. You know what I mean? Like, it was clearly like, obviously this is something going on. So we did the neuropsych evaluation. She did not have autism. Which I kind of was like, that would be very suspicious if she did all of a sudden, because she didn't all this time. And we know typically that they do have some type of presentation before the age of 2. You know what I mean? So we went that whole route, and yeah, it was a lot of undoing within that, of like, what do we want to call this? So we didn't actually talk to her about it initially. It wasn't until really she started to heal, and I would say like come back to us in terms of like her ability to be present and have really like meaningful conversations, that probably like last year, or maybe she was 11 and a half, where we started talking about, hey, this is what your body's healing from. And we kind of always phrased it like that. This is what your body's healing from. Um, but this is how you are impacted by the world differently than other people. And this is why it's hard sometimes to do, like, you're struggling through these different things. This is why. And so we tried to be really careful not to frame it from a perspective of permanence. Um, and honestly, like, that's just because pandas is not necessarily always permanent. I
Right.
don't know how we would have addressed it if it was something that was permanent, like, losing a limb. That would be different. Like, it's okay to say you don't have an arm
Right.
if your arm has been cut off.
I like what you're saying, because like I think if there's two things I could leave parents with, is number one, you've got to be led by the Holy Spirit in all of these
Yes.
things for your child. Because when I
Yes.
look back, I mean, even in just talking about this with you now, like, you know, even in thinking this through before we talked this morning, I was
Yeah.
like, gosh, I wish we would have done that differently with, I felt so alone not being able to share his diagnosis with anyone. Well, guess what? He probably didn't have it. So,
Yes.
so like
Right.
my husband, maybe he was right. Maybe he
Yeah.
was led by the Holy Spirit to say, hey, let's not share this with everyone. Like, and let's not tell him, because
Right.
he probably, so in a way, you got to be led by the Holy Spirit. And what does he tell you? And
Right.
it's going to be different than it will be for your friend, because your
Right.
child is different, your situation is different, and you have the authority given by him for your child. So
Yes.
yeah, so he will give you even if you're not, like, some people that I work with sometimes are like, I don't know how to hear from God. Even if you don't hear from him in sort of typical ways, he'll
Yes.
nudge you. Like, you'll read a scripture, he will guide you. He cares more
Right.
about you than you do. Number one. And number
Right.
two, if there is a diagnosis to be had, like hearing loss, we have really tried as much as we can to make it a hope-filled thing.
Yep.
Like you're saying,
Yep.
like, this is something you were diagnosed with. God has all power to,
Mhm.
to do anything he wants with this diagnosis.
Yep.
And also it doesn't have to limit you. When my
Right.
kid was in, the school that we go to has a track where you learn everything in English for half a day, and then you turn around and you learn that same stuff again in Mandarin Chinese.
What?
Learn Mandarin immersion.
Wow.
That's half of the school, and then the other half only learns it in English.
Wow.
I wanted him to be in the Mandarin program. He wanted to be in the Mandarin program. And I really felt like that was the right thing based on a couple of even prophetic words I'd gotten about my child going to
Yeah.
China someday. And anyway, I was like, I really want him to be in the Mandarin program. Well, I
Yeah.
got a call from the principal a month before school started, his kindergarten year. And she said, hey, I see on here he has hearing loss. And I don't think Chinese will be good for him because that's going to be hard for him to, to understand. And
Yeah.
she cared. And I was like, I talked to his speech teacher at the time, or his speech pathologist, and she said, you know what? You need to give him every opportunity that any
Yeah.
other kid has.
Yeah.
And so he's like, I want to do the Mandarin program. So I said, okay, we will try it out. Sure enough, he did great. He was one of the
Great.
top Mandarin speaking
Yeah.
students. Like, so it
Amazing.
would have been a bummer if I had taken that diagnosis and been like, oh, well,
Yeah.
you can't, you have hearing loss, you can't. Instead, I thought, let's try it. I think that's a good
Yep.
posture. Like, let's try, let's be hope filled about this,
Yes.
knowing that, yes, there will be differences for him. I mean, there are for sure,
Right.
but it doesn't have to be this overwhelming, um, it doesn't have to dictate what he can and can't do in his life.
Right.
So, yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's been a helpful way to approach it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I will say in different seasons that probably looks different, right? Like I noticed this last year was really, really hard for me to, well, it was hard for a lot of reasons, but it was hard for me to uh it was like as Alexis was healing and growing even out of like different food allergies and different limitations, to let her go, like,
Yeah.
and to let her try them. And then like I had to position myself not from a place of fear of like, what if we do this and it massively backfires into like a major neurological flare? That was like my big fear.
Yes.
And I'm like, but if I don't let her, we'll never know. Like we'll never know. And so I had this random thought pop into my head one morning that was like, let her lead.
So
And I was like, well, that sounds a little bit terrifying, but it also sounds like the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to let her lead in her limitations, meaning like let her lead what she's able to do. If she feels like she wants to try out for volleyball, we'll give it a shot and we'll see how it goes and we'll see how her body responds. And because I didn't, at the end of the day, I didn't want to be the mom. We've already had to have so many restrictions, so many, like not being able to swim in a chlorinated pool, not being able to wear like jeans and socks, and um like having to really pay attention to being overheated because she couldn't, her, that part of her brain couldn't actually sense when she was overheated or too cold. So like things like that that we had to like insulate her from all of this time, that now that she's healing we don't have to insulate her from, but I have to actively choose to let her lead, right? Like within reason. I'm not saying she's in, she's an adult and like responsible for all the things, but I'm just saying like, she's like, Mom, I really want to try yogurt. I'm like, okay, well, we haven't tried fermented foods in a long time. That's been really aggravating to you in the past. So we'll give it a shot. And, and she didn't have any neurological symptoms from it. She did have a little bit of a tummy upset, and she was fine. But I'm like, I can't, like, it's not emotionally healthy to be that limited for so long. And so now that those restraints are gone, um there's a little bit more freedom to move, like you said, give them every opportunity. But I think at least in our case that presented a lot of anxiety for me because I was like, oh, I have to let go of a
Mhm.
lot of coping that got me through the last 4 years but no longer serves me now. And that was hard. That was a hard growth path to take. Would you say for you, when we kind of talked about grief a little bit within that and not having the time to journal and like write stuff out, did that grief come later for you? Or
Yes.
do you, yeah, okay, what was that like?
Yeah, I think I was really trying to get through those first few years with all the kids being
All
born
the
and
kids, yeah.
all the and, my last two were twins, and then I actually ended up having heart failure 8 days after I had my twins, and so that was a year of recovery. And anyway,
Yeah.
I think for me, I think what when it really hit me was when my daughter, which is one of my twins, was 5. She also was diagnosed with hearing loss.
Oh no.
At the time, we didn't know if it was going to be as profound or not. They were going to do
Yeah.
some more testing. So, but she does have hearing loss, but it isn't as profound. But it
Okay.
does affect her.
Yeah.
So when my daughter was diagnosed that night, I came home and a friend was over and I was doing dishes. So my back, I don't know why this like is an important detail to me. My back was turned to her and she's telling me, well, like I'm just telling her matter of factly, yeah, Sutton was diagnosed with hearing loss today. And she's like, isn't that sad?
Yeah.
And because like I guess my back was turned to her. I'm not even like, I'm just
Yeah.
doing dishes. Like, yeah, she was diagnosed with hearing loss. And I'm like, oh, like it was like a oh
Oh, that is sad.
my gosh, that is sad. And in my mind, I was thinking, I'm going to put that on the shelf. I'm not going to grieve that.
Mhm.
I don't have time. We don't even know how profound it is, blah, blah, blah. And so I had been really working on my own, like, it's not normal for me to try to dive into sadness. I want to avoid
Sure.
it at all costs.
Yeah.
So at that time, I was like, oh gosh, this is probably one of those times you're supposed to be sad. And like, you're supposed to
Yeah.
recognize your sadness. I am sad, but recognize it.
Yeah.
So I that
Right.
night, my husband was out of town. That night, I put on sad music
Mm.
and I let myself cry.
Good.
And like it felt so cathartic. I'm a theater major. I have my master's degree in theater, and the Greeks used to use theater as what they called a catharsis. It was a spiritual
Oh,
experience, which was
wow.
a cleansing of
Yeah.
sadness. Like have you ever watched a movie and it's like, I just needed to cry, and you're just,
Yeah.
you're trying to feel so much better after. So
Yeah.
I think I allowed myself that catharsis and
Good.
it helped, but I think I never, I think part of what, coming back to isolation, part of what made me feel so alone all those years is that I didn't let myself be sad in the process. And so when you're not sad, you'll never
Yeah.
receive
Mhm.
comfort.
Oh,
You
there it is. Yeah.
can't be comforted if you're not sad.
Yeah.
So I felt like nobody cares. I'm all alone.
Yeah.
Nobody understands. Well, guess what? I wasn't letting people in.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge part
Absolutely.
of getting through this. You don't have to sit around, you don't have time to grieve every single day, but you can have moments of catharsis and you can definitely have moments of letting people into, I'm really sad.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's really good. And that's funny because I feel like we had a Voxer conversation around that
We might have.
sometime last year. I don't remember. But I remember us having that conversation. I was like, oh yeah, that is accurate. That we can't be comforted if we're not willing to be sad. It's kind of, I think about Inside Out a lot with sadness and how Joy is dragging sadness around and because she's like, ah, come on, sadness, cheer up, and but sadness has something really important to say and something really important to bring to the picture, but then that goes into our fear of, like, we're already suffering,
Yes.
we're already in pain, and like we don't want to feel more pain. That feels like the opposite of what we should do. And so, but at the same time, we actually move through it faster when we allow ourselves to feel it
True.
and honor it and give it a voice and even validate yourself or be validated by somebody else. Like,
Yeah.
having a friend that can say like, gosh, that's really sad. Like, or I'm sad for you.
Yes.
Like when people say that to me, that usually will trigger the, oh,
Oh.
oh,
Uh-huh.
I am also sad about
Mhm.
this and I probably should feel sad about it. So, I love that. And I think it's normal also, like just throughout all the different cycles that we go through, as special needs moms, it's not linear at all. Like at all. Something random can pop up that causes a grief reaction or a triggered response of like, oh, this feels so close to home, right? And so I think just giving yourself a lot of compassion, speaking to the listeners out there, a lot of compassion for the fact that you may not be able to process, you won't be able to process everything, at least at the beginning. There was stuff grief wise that didn't come up for me until 3 years in. And all of a sudden, it was all the anger, all the bargaining, all the denial, all of it. And I just had to feel it. And like, I couldn't choose the timeline. It didn't make any sense. It's just how grief in the body works. And so, what would you say, just as we're kind of wrapping up this episode? You've given some really, really, really good nuggets on navigating the loneliness and, what you would have done differently, looking back. even like knowing that it was still a good decision at the time, but like maybe would have offered you some more comfort.
Right.
What would you say to moms who are listening today? Any words of wisdom for us?
I think you kind of mentioned it earlier. As hard as it feels right now, and it is hard. Time helps. Like maturity helps.
Yeah.
Um, your circumstances will not always look exactly like they do today.
Yes.
Things get better,
Mhm.
things change, some things get worse, you know,
Yeah.
but you're not stuck in this exact amount of pain and this exact amount of overwhelm
Yeah.
forever.
Yeah. That's good.
Mhm.
That's really good. And it's true. And I think the part that we don't want to acknowledge is that we do get stronger
Yes.
because we like
Yes.
100%. And
Yes.
it's like, I would probably want to punch somebody if they said, "Well, good thing it's making you stronger." Like, don't ever say that. Don't ever say that.
No, don't ever say that.
I've never had anybody say that to me, but like I had the thoughts of like, "Well, I'm probably building some really good muscle here."
Yes.
But that like it's not fun. And
No.
but the truth is that we do develop new skills. We do
Sure.
become more resilient. We do learn a lot about ourselves. We learn a lot about our families. And we do come out on the other side different, and that's okay. But it is that place of like just giving yourself a lot of grace for the process. And no, I mean, I think our feelings tend to tell us like this is forever, right? I don't know what mechanism that is in the brain,
I
but
know.
it's there. Like when we're happy, we want to feel happy forever. When we're sad, we're worried we're going to be sad forever. When we're depressed, we feel like we're going to be depressed forever. But that's
That's
not the facts.
that's true.
And I think the flip side to that is that we do get stronger and we do learn how to manage something we never thought we would ever have to manage, right? That it's nobody's dream for parenthood is autism, special needs, autoimmune disorders. That's nobody's, when we're like saying our wedding vows, we're not like, gosh, I just really hope that I have the worst case scenario. Like nobody thinks they're going to end up there, right? And so, but the fact is that we do gain skills, we do gain resilience, and like you said, it's not always going to be that way. So, thank you so much, Tiffany, for sharing. I will make sure to put some links to follow you. And if anybody's interested in her coaching services, she is a wonderful Christ Centered coach that I love to just get to be friends with, number one, but get to learn from. And I've done some of your trainings before, and they are just phenomenal. So thank you so much for your time today, Tiffany.
Bless you and bless all of you listening.
Thank you.
Bye.